Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our webinar on handling the competition. My name is Will Hooton. I'm a business consultant here at the Penn State SBDC, and I'll be asking questions of our guest, Dr. Krug, who I will be introducing here in a moment. But would like to say a few words here about the SBDC. So the SBDC here in Pennsylvania is Penn State's one of 16. We are a network that covers every county here in Pennsylvania. So you can see here on the map on our right that we are here located in the middle. We cover Center County, Mifflin County, Clinton, and Lycoming. And like I said, we are part of a network of other SBDCs here in Pennsylvania. We have 16, and there's actually over 900 SBDCs in America. The SBDC network was created by the Small Business Administration. So the different services that we have here at our center are consulting. We do free, confidential business consulting. It might be just one-on-one. It could be you and a few other of our consultants here. And nice thing about being part of a network is if you have questions or needs that we may not be able to service here at this center, we can reach out to the other SBDCs and find someone that will be able to help you. Different training events that we have, like our first step presentation, which is every second Tuesday of the month, and it's a 101 on starting your business and what all entails. And we also have other webinars like QuickBooks as well. And then you can find all this information on our website at SBDC, which is our acronym, sbdc.psu.edu, and other informational resources that we have available as well. Different resources and programs like a search engine optimization audit for your website, different things for international trade and business valuation as well. And we try to stay very well connected in our community of entrepreneurial resources. So with the chambers and so on and so forth. So if there are other centers or other resources available that may be able to help you in your business's endeavor, we like to make those introductions as well. So speaking of introductions, I would like to introduce our guest today, Dr. Krug, and a little bit about him, his bio. So Dr. Krug is an experienced leader with 35 years of experience as a U.S. Navy officer, corporate executive, consultant, academic dean, university professor, and nonprofit leader. Krug earned his PhD in strategic management from Indiana University and his master's in international business and his bachelor's in economics from Penn State. He has also completed executive programs at Harvard, University of Pennsylvania, University of Virginia, Northwest University, and Babson College. He currently serves as the faculty of the Smeal Business of College at Penn State, where he teaches strategy, leadership, and innovation in technology. He is also program director for Penn State's Masters in Strategic Management and Executive Leadership program. Before moving to Penn State, Krug was dean of Ziegler, hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly, College of Business at Bloomsburg, University of Pennsylvania, where he raised the largest donations in Pennsylvania state system, which includes the naming of the Terry and Joanne Ziegler College of Business. He previously served as Associate Dean of Graduate Programs and Director of the Center for International Business at Loyola University, New Orleans, where he also held the Jack and Veda Reynolds Chair of International Business. He has received numerous teaching awards at the University of Illinois and Urbana-Champaign College of William and Mary, University of Memphis, and Loyola University, among others. Krug began his corporate career in banking in Dusseldorf, Germany, and in Vienna, Austria. After, after held numerous executive positions in finance and strategic planning in Europe, Latin America, and the United States at Texas Instruments and PepsiCo. He is an active consultant in strategy and international business and has worked as a seminar speaker and consultant with Accenture, Price Waterhouse Cooper, and McKinsey. As an undergraduate student at Penn State, he was a member of the Naval ROTC unit and later served as the U.S. Naval Reserves Officer Supply Corps. And I am extremely excited to have him here and to get to ask him a bunch of questions here on competition, and let's go ahead and get started. Again, thank you so much for coming. Really appreciate this, and looking forward to our conversation here.
We're
Yes.
good.
Yes. So let's go ahead and get started. Got an easy question for you. What is competition?
Okay, and I can't see who's actually attending today, so I'm assuming that I probably have a few of my master students from the strategy class that just ended. And we had a pretty exceptional group of students this semester. And I've been teaching strategy for about 28 years now. And it really was one of the best groups that I've had in all these years. So if those people are here, they'll hear a lot of some similar things that we discussed during the semester. And I think that one of the things that struck me as I went down through these questions, and I've done quite a bit of consulting with startups as well through the Happy Valley Launchbox and Ben Franklin and technology partners. And I find that there are differences between small businesses and startup companies. However, when you look at the strategy analysis, you have a lot of commonalities. So I think that when we talk about competition, we're typically talking about other rivals, other companies that are providing the same product or service as your company and serving the same customer, oftentimes with a very similar product. So what really becomes important in competitive analysis, of course, is that, how do you win this competitive game? And you typically win it one of two ways. You either serve the customer better than your rivals, for example, through superior customer service, or you do something completely different. And two really good examples really struck me as I was thinking about this. One, I talked about this during the strategy class this semester, and that's Chick-fil-A. Having worked with PepsiCo and Kentucky Fried Chickens, this was of particular interest to me, and it continues to this day, that when you walk into a Chick-fil-A, that everything they do is executed almost flawlessly, from the way that they bring you into their restaurants, the way that they take your order, the way they process the order, your payment, the way they deliver the food to you, their cleanliness, the service, the value. They really, in my mind, are the leader in this industry, and it explains a lot why Chick-fil-A is a leader. And I think this is the same thing regardless of the type of company, whether it's a small business, a startup. These concepts are pretty much the same. Another good example is Delta Airlines. I've flown a lot, pretty extensively over the last 40 years. And Delta, American, and United, which are the three that have survived, really for about 30 years competed with the same routes, similar aircraft, almost identical strategies, so that it really has been almost a competition for low cost. And low cost is a really tough way to establish a competitive advantage, unless you're a Walmart, for example, that just has superior supply chain management capabilities. And Delta, about 3 years ago, decided to break off from this low cost strategy and begin to offer superior customer service. And they started to focus a little bit more on the business consumer. This is really important because they really started to identify different segments in the industry where they could create a differentiation advantage. And with that, they were able to raise prices. So if you compare prices, you'll often see that Delta has a higher price point. And of course, the question is, are customers both attracted to Delta, and are they willing to pay these price premiums? So all of this really is referring mainly to direct rivals, people who are competing against you in your space, competing for the same customer, oftentimes trying to do the same thing. We can also talk about indirect competitors, and oftentimes we'll look at the value chain, that suppliers, distributors, customers are all part of that competitive analysis that you should be looking at. For example, if you're a supplier, suppliers can extract profit by raising prices that you pay, which lowers your margin. So the relationship you have with suppliers becomes almost as important as it does in how you compete with rivals. So if you take a Walmart, for example, they've become so large now that they've got really tremendous negotiating power to demand lower prices from companies like Procter and Gamble. If you're competing against a Walmart, just as an example, that means you have to compete against Walmart for the same suppliers, and that becomes really an important part of that competitive process. Distributors also can extract profitability from you. When computers were distributed through Best Buy and Circuit City, for example, those concepts had quite a bit of power to demand lower prices from computer manufacturers. Apple's a great example of how they've managed this. Apple now is selling direct and they're selling through their own stores. So they've tried to eliminate distributor power by actually incorporating that within their own value chain. Customers also very important. Do they have a willingness to pay? Substitutes, Starbucks, of course, coming in with coffee, bottled water. These become very competitive for Coke and Pepsi, who you traditionally think are directly competing for soft drink sales. But when you have substitutes that consumers might buy instead, that becomes a really important part of the competitive process too. And we can also talk about complements such as government regulations. Tesla, great example of this. They've taken advantage of a lot of the environmental regulations and funding from the U.S. government to support their development of an all-electric vehicle. And also industry complements like automobile parts. Having availability of parts makes automobile companies a lot stronger. One of the things that we do a lot of course, is to do a basic 5 forces model that was developed by Michael Porter. Great analytical tool for trying to understand all of these concepts.
Understood. And so, whenever we see clients here at the SBDC, people will come in with an idea for a business and they'll think, this is probably the best thing since sliced bread. And then they'll, want to go ahead out and create it or, start building this business. And then we got to slow them down a little bit. And, first we might start off by asking them, look into what your customers actually want. Are you sure this is really what it is? And inevitably the conversation rolls around the competition. And so if you were to explain then to a small business why it's important to look at your competition, what would you say?
Right. Well, strategy in a simplified form, and we spoke about this in the class also. Richard Vermelt's really great for this. So showed a video of him talking about strategy being to identify customer problem and then solve it. So strategy, to a large extent, is about problem solving. That is solving a customer problem. But if we back up, it becomes really important in how you position yourself in the industry. So, for example, are you competing with a lot of other very strong competitors in the same industry? This is direct competition. You look at Walmart again, a lot of companies compete in this space, but Walmart just does it better. But you can also look at your industry and segment it into groups. So industry segments becomes a really important way that a small business can differentiate itself and avoid direct competition from a Walmart. And so if you look at a CVS or Walgreens, they are competing on slightly different competitive dimensions. They don't compete on low cost, but they do have greater convenience, and they have merchandise like soft drinks, pharmaceutical products, potato chips, things that customers might want in an evening and not be willing to drive all the way out to Walmart. So they drive in, park right in front of CVS or Walgreens, and they go in and they're willing to pay a higher price to get these products. So in essence, CVS and Walgreens have understood that we're not going to compete directly against Walmart. So how do we compete? Well, we compete by solving a slightly different customer problem, convenience, and make it convenient, and then we attract customers. Another important part of this is, can you identify white space in the industry? Probably most people here have heard that concept and used it. White space is a part of the industry where competitors are not currently competing or customer needs are not being met. Dropbox is an example I love to use because they came into that space when there were several other really strong competitors like Mozy and Carbonite. Microsoft and Google are now in that space as well. But they identified a unique value proposition where they were offering not only file backup, but file sharing, access to information across multiple devices. And so they found a way to enter an industry as a late mover and offer a slightly different value proposition that enabled them to actually avoid direct competition and attract suppliers. Again, if you don't know the structure of competition in your industry, then it's really tough to even begin the process of developing a strategic plan. So again, Five Forces model is great for this. Strategy mapping is a great tool. Industry strategic group maps are really important tools for trying to understand where competitors are competing, trying to identify that space where there is less competition and where you might be able to actually establish a firm foothold.
Right, right. And so doing this competitor analysis, looking into it, it seems like it's trying to find where you're positioned. Like so if your thought going in before you did your analysis, like, okay, maybe we'll do this cheaper, right? But like you said with Walmart, and good luck. So maybe you can't compete there. But by analyzing the competition, the industry, so on and so forth, you see, oh, okay, maybe here's an area that's missing, or this is after looking at it, then you can say I can compete in these areas. Maybe it is the customer service, for example, like you've mentioned. So by doing that, it kind of allows you to so that's kind of one of the goals in a way, I guess is what I'm trying to say, is that whenever you're doing this analysis, it's to help better understand where you could have a competitive advantage. And so maybe that's then where the avenue you need to go into enter a market, possibly, correct?
Right. And I think the most important part of this is trying to identify the competitive dimension that you're using to attract consumers.
Mhm,
And so then it becomes a question: are there other competitors who are trying to solve the same customer problem as you?
mhm,
And if there are, then are you able to serve that customer or solve that problem as well as existing customers? And one example that I love to use is many years ago when I was living in Memphis. This is about 30 years ago. I used to go to a food court over lunch, and I can remember going through the Italian food court restaurant and ordering meatballs, and for the price they only gave me a couple of meatballs, and I said, are those is that all that I get? And the answer was, yes, that's all you get. Well, that really alienated me because I didn't think that I was getting value for my money. But the
mhm,
Chinese restaurant, it was run by, well, a Chinese woman was there, worked really hard, always very polite, and she would just pile on the food. It was more food than I could handle, or probably most consumers couldn't eat everything that was put on the plate. But that really struck me that they were essentially executing very well, and they also understood that consumers want value. And if you're not providing the value that a consumer believes should be given the price, you're going to lose those customers. So I became very loyal to that Chinese restaurant because the food was always good, it was always hot, and they always gave me good value. And this is really important because if
mhm.
a customer has one bad experience with your product, you're liable to lose that customer forever. And the goal of success, of course, is to deliver such value that the customer keeps coming back, and they're also willing to pay the price that you need to make a profit. In the case of a restaurant, just as one example, you've got enormous fixed costs. So you've got all that food that is sitting out there that's already prepared. And if you alienate a few of your customers, all of a sudden, then you no longer are selling enough units and you end up throwing food out. So you've already spent money on these fixed costs. And in the case of the Chinese restaurant, great example that they were providing value, and I kept going back over and over and over again. And to them, their costs were not rising, but their
Mhm.
revenues were rising. And as your revenues and your sales rise, that increases your profitability in sales. So, I think that's
Yeah.
something that a lot of businesses fail to understand. That
Mhm.
you've got to attract the consumer, and then you've got to keep them.
And then you got to keep them, no doubt. And so once we, gotten this far, understand all this and why it's important to analyze. But how should a business go about doing this and to evaluate their competition?
Yeah, well, we use the concept of competitive advantage. You just used that a minute ago, and a lot of people get that term confused. Competitive advantage is very simply the reason why a consumer buys your product or service instead of somebody else's. So you walk into Walmart, you walk into the coffee aisle or the toothpaste aisle, you've got a wide range of products that you could choose from. Which one do you actually pick up? For example, toothpaste. You pick up Crest toothpaste, and you do it every time. What's the reason that you choose that product instead of another? Well, the answer to that question is the competitive advantage of that company. It might be branding for Procter and Gamble. It might be the fact that you think that this particular toothpaste lowers cavities, or has other attributes. But it really doesn't matter. Whatever the reason is that you're buying that product defines the competitive advantage that you have for that product. So it's really important that you try to understand what the consumer is after. Now, I asked some undergraduate students this many years ago, and asked them, what do you think the competitive advantage of Texas Instruments is? And a few students said they have high level of research and development. Well, if you're selling a semiconductor to an IBM, for example, when they were selling computers, and you ask IBM, why are you buying chips from TI? They are not going to respond, well, TI has high levels of R&D, right? Their answer is going to be because TI's chip is technologically superior, or their memory chip is a lower price point than Intel, which was one of our major competitors at that time. That's really important that you understand that. So when you start to look at competitors, you really need to ask, what are competitors doing well? Are they serving the customer well? What are they not doing well? And also, what are they not doing, which is the white space? And depending on which industry segment you're operating under, trying to understand what your competitors are doing, what type of competitive advantage or value proposition they're trying to offer consumers, gives you a lot of great information on, number one, do you want to compete with these competitors given their value proposition? Or if your rivals are really successful, then maybe you need to be defining a different value proposition that's not being adequately served. And then you allocate resources to creating that value proposition.
Oh, very good. And so I'm sure for some people, this is maybe even their first time trying to do a competitor analysis, or maybe it has been a while for some other business owners. So whenever they're going and looking at the competition, what are some common mistakes maybe that they may be making whenever they're analyzing their competition?
Yeah, and I can pull in an example from my advising through Happy Valley Launchbox. I've advised a number of startups, and we had a really an outstanding individual who developed a trash can that had a lid that could not be opened by animals, by your cat, by your dog. And when I sat in on the first presentation, he spoke in terms of the value proposition being that your dog is not going to open up the trash can and spread your garbage all over your kitchen. And I said, well, okay, I get that, but is that enough to get a consumer to buy your product and pay the $50 price point that you want on it? What is it about dog owners or cat owners that's different? Well, dog and cat owners tend to be fiercely loyal to their pet, right? They treat their pets almost like children. So it's really the pet that they're concerned about a lot more than they are about whether garbage is spread over their kitchen, though they might not like that.
Right.
So I said, have you ever considered that your value proposition maybe should be the health of your pet? That if your dog or cat gets into your garbage and eats garbage and becomes ill, you don't want that for your pet. That's the type of thing, if you put that into a pet store, That is where very loyal pet owners are going to go to get this type of a product, and they're probably going to be willing to pay a higher price. And he came to me after, and he said, "Holy cow! When you said that, a light bulb went off, and that became his value proposition." Now, and this is why sometimes talking with other people about your concept gives you ideas that you never would have thought about. And when he heard it, he said, "I don't know why I didn't think about it." Well, it wasn't that he wasn't intelligent. It was just that he had already made a decision and he was going in one direction. And now he heard a different viewpoint and thought, wow, this customer value proposition is much better, especially when you're trying to get into the market for the very first time. Some other things that I might mention
Yeah.
is that a lot of companies get caught up in the weeds. And Jim Collins, some of you may have read Good to Great. That came out in 2001. It's published a long time ago now, but he has a chapter in there that talks about sticking to your knitting. Should you be a diver that does really complicated dives with loop-de-loops and turns, or should you be a diver who does a simple dive over and over and over again perfectly? And I thought that was a pretty great example of taking a simple value proposition, executing it flawlessly. And if you do that, then all of a sudden you've created something unique in your industry. So, strategy is as much about what you don't do as what you do, right? So, we talk a lot about resource-based theory. Michael Porter has a great article in Harvard Business Review called "What is Strategy?" All of my students read that. And that deals with that very simple notion that you have to understand what it is that your customer wants from your product. And it doesn't need to be complex, but once you have decided on that, you need to do it better than everybody else.
Right. Understood. And if say I'm having trouble evaluating these my competitors, what should I do?
Yeah, well, a lot of people might say, look for outside expertise. Outside advisors are always a good thing.
Mhm.
When I was at PepsiCo, we hired Accenture for a number of projects, and what I remember from those projects were that we spent like $50 to $100,000 for a paper that was really not any better than the papers that my MBAs are producing in their MBA program. So you have to be really careful about spending a lot of money, especially as a small business, when funding is really important. If you're competing in a local market, I think it's much more valuable to visit your competitors. Go into the store, go into the restaurant, whatever it is, see what they're doing. What are they doing well? What are they doing wrong? And that gives you enormous competitive intelligence. So, and that information is really valuable because you might identify something that they're doing so well that your conclusion is, what, if I'm coming into this market for the very first time, I'm going to have a really tough time out competing this particular small business on this value proposition because they're established and they're doing it very well. But here's something they're doing not very well, and so maybe I can be successful by offering this value chain even better.
I see. I see. And whenever you're analyzing your competition, you're trying to find opportunities. So, uh, could you help explain how do you find these uh, opportunities in the market that maybe your competitors haven't seen yet?
I think that there was an article by Reeves in Harvard Business Review called uh, "What Strategy is Your Strategy?" I'm pretty sure that's the correct title. And they talk about they have four different types of industries or strategies: classical, visionary, adaptive, and shaping.
Mhm.
And I think this becomes really important. You have to understand exactly what type of industry you're competing in before you can really understand how to formulate strategy or to develop a plan. You take, for example, what they call a classical strategy. This is a typical industry that's well established. You have a lot of competitors in them, and the industry structure really isn't changing over time. Well, how do you compete in an industry like that? Well, this is where execution becomes really important. But there are other industries that are more visionary, where you have competitors who try to do something different, and a small business can do the same thing. One of the cases we analyze is Cemex, the cement company in Mexico. And cement, when you talk about that industry, you typically think about it about companies that manufacture very standardized products. They can't differentiate it. It's heavy to transport. But Cemex decided that they were going to differentiate themselves, for example, by guaranteeing deliveries within 30 minutes, by offering superior customer service. They used IT to match demand and supply so that they could move cement from one location to another much more quickly. So they essentially broke away from competition to offer something very differentiated, and that gave them the ability to not only attract consumers, but to charge a higher price. Adaptive strategies, I think about the Gap. Probably most people here have been in the Gap at one time or another in your life. When I was younger, I used to buy clothing from there. When you're dealing with an industry like fashion, you're dealing with consumer trends that change overnight, and therefore it's very difficult to predict. So you really can't use data analytics to determine what somebody's fashion desire is going to be 6 months from now. You really need subjective and intuitive, or people with intuitive abilities to try to identify emerging customer needs, and then you try to get out in front of competitors. And then last is the shaping industry, where you're talking about a Netflix. When Netflix, they used to rent out DVDs, and then they went into streaming. So they leveraged internet as internet came on board, and they were the first to get out and stream. And they developed a really strong first mover advantage by changing the structure of the industry, by doing something completely different. Airbnb has done this in rentals. Amazon has done this by using a really superior and friendly web platform, customer satisfaction industries, product suggestions. Apple did this with the mobile phone by putting applications on a phone that before that was really the value proposition was just mobile communications. So I think that you really have to understand what is the structure of your industry.
Mhm.
And these are four really great categories to try to understand where the industry is. And then you can start to ask, well, can I compete within the existing structure, or should I move away into one of these other quadrants by creating something unique? And I think I did. If I didn't provide this, I can certainly provide the citation. But the Reeves article is a pretty short article that talks about this and really valuable insights for small businesses, I think.
Wonderful. And so I guess along that line then too, so once you've identified maybe this opportunity or maybe you just want to come out with a new product, how important is it for businesses to move quickly?
This is a great question, because most people think that they need to be first movers, right? Being a first mover has a lot of danger associated with it, because when you come out with a new product, especially if it's based on technology or it's a product attribute, and the product is used by consumers for the very first time, and it doesn't perform the way that you promised, you can alienate your consumers and find that you'll be out of business. So sometimes a late mover can come into the market without that initial funding from the first mover, and they can learn from the mistakes of that first mover, and then iterate and come in with a more perfected product or service, and overcome that first mover advantage. Airbnb is a great example of this, where they were trying to match people who had properties that they wanted to rent with people who wanted to rent a property, like a business person who's going to New York and they can't find a hotel room. So Airbnb finds someone who has an extra room and rent it out to you. But Airbnb, you can even rent a castle in Europe or a vineyard for a weekend in California. But with Airbnb, it was really important that they moved really slowly, because you didn't want to grow too many renters when you didn't have people to rent, because if you do that, you alienate your renters. but you didn't want to have too many people who wanted to rent, but too few people who want to rent. So and another great example is DuPont when they developed Kevlar. We know Kevlar through their bulletproof vests the most, but initially Kevlar was developed to be a Kevlar belted tire, which would replace their ply tire that used to peel apart. And in their case, they had to compete with Michelin that had just come out with a steel belted radial. And so the customer choice was, do I select a Kevlar belted radial or a steel belted radial? In this case, Kevlar really needed to move very, very quickly to establish, to attract customer sales and to get customers to use the product and become loyal. And unfortunately, they couldn't justify spending the capital to move that quickly. And the steel belted radial, consumers just looked at that name and they thought, if I'm going to buy one or the other, steel belted sounds like a better tire, when in fact the Kevlar belted tires were actually just as good. But Kevlar ended up abandoning that business because they were unable to move quickly enough. So this is a really important question. Should we be a first mover or should we be a late mover? Being a late mover has a lot of benefits, because you don't have to expend the capital and you can iterate over and over again until you get a much better product that solves that customer problem, and you can overcome that first mover advantage.
Oh, I see. And so with part of this process then too, I assume networking would have to be extremely important. But how important would this be for a business?
Yeah, for a small business or a startup, it's absolutely critical, right?
Mhm.
Because especially if you're operating a small business, for example, you take over your family business and you're in a small town where people get to know you, and you have sort of a limited competitive range, geographically. Very different from a Nike, which sells all over the world. You may be selling in a limited geographical space in Pennsylvania. Then the relationships become absolutely critical. Um, and I have to say that that this is where you have to do a value chain analysis. You have to look at your suppliers, your distributors, your customers, and what all of those different parts of the value chain want, because you have to service your suppliers and distributors in the same way that you service your customers. When I lived in Memphis, so again 30 years ago now, I taught in the executive MBA program down there. We had a lot of executives from international paper. We talked about this a lot. They were selling paper machines, which are extremely expensive, to a company down along the Mississippi River. They would use the water of the Mississippi River. They actually put their engineers in their customers' facilities to work alongside the equipment operators so that they could help make the machines a lot more efficient and to try to lower costs. And so it was that relationship that made the customer a lot more profitable and a lot more efficient. And without that relationship, of course, then you're just nothing more than just a seller of a machine, and you become like every other seller. So, and I wrote in my notes, this is not rocket science. It's easy. Networking is a matter of getting out and talking to a lot of people. You can't talk to people over the phone or through the internet. You've got to have that personal relationship. I learned that the hard way at Texas Instruments when I was the finance director looking at all of our computer shipments around Latin America. And I found that when I was addressing people through email, I was a lot tougher. I would say, no, you can't have this shipment of computers until you pay off your last invoice. I can remember one time going down to Venezuela visiting the computer distributor. He invited me to his home. I had dinner with his wife. I got to know his children. I got to know his dog. All of a sudden, a relationship developed out of that. I realized that they were struggling as a business, but they were awfully honest people. And all of a sudden, my whole approach to that business changed. And so I started to ship computers to them, because if they don't have inventory that they can sell, they don't collect the money that can be used to pay Texas Instruments. And remember, my boss said to me, "Why are you shipping computers to Venezuela when we have outstanding invoices?" And I said, "Because I trust them. I've got a good relationship, and I know that they're going to pay me back, and they need this inventory." So I think that probably with small businesses, this type of relationship is probably even more critical than an established company. Because let's face it, a Nike has tremendous power simply through branding. A small business is going to build brand through its relationships and the way that it deals with consumer, and the value proposition that it delivers.
Right. And, small businesses could get involved through their chambers, local entrepreneur meetups, come to the SBDC too. Here, and we have many other programs as well to meet other entrepreneurs, other possibly partners, and so on and so forth. So yes, I would
Yeah.
definitely echo all that.
Yeah, I think I'll just add to that. When you think about visiting an SBDC, oftentimes business people will think, well, I just don't have time to do that, right? But
Right.
going to an organization like that and meeting people is just simply invaluable, because you end up learning things, you meet people, you establish relationships and contacts that
Mhm.
is going to be invaluable to your long-term success. And it's just something that you've got to understand, that it may not have an immediate deliverable, but it almost always has an intermediate and a long-term, value associated with it.
Right. And so, how important would it be for then, I guess, studying market trends? You had brought it up, but I guess, yeah, could you speak a little bit more about what that all entails?
Yeah, and again, I go back to the Reeves grid. It depends on the structure of your industry, right?
Right.
If you're in an adaptive industry, like the Gap, where fashion is not easily predicted, it's your ability to respond very quickly to emerging, that is, to identify emerging customer needs and then respond very quickly.
Hmm.
That is very different from a visionary structure, where you're going to you might conclude that, what, I'm doing the same thing as my competitors in the area. What can I do differently? It's
Hmm.
sort of like Cemex. You know what? People are buying cement based on cost, therefore they're not loyal to me. What can I do different? Well, another great example is Haier, the Chinese home appliance manufacturer. They make washers, dryers, and they make robots today. But when they were trying to compete initially in the Chinese market, consumers expected washers and dryers and refrigerators to be really low quality. So their CEO decided that, what, we're going to change the way we do business. And he ended up, he had people on the manufacturing line bring out the refrigerators, and he had them destroy them with sledgehammers. And he made the point, we are no longer going to produce low quality refrigerators. We are going to be the highest quality manufacturer. And once consumers started to see that the Haier refrigerator was a higher quality refrigerator, they changed loyalties, and they started to buy Haier. And this today, of course, it's hard to buy for example, a miniature refrigerator for your dorm room that is not a Haier. They've really dominated this market. So the structure of your industry is really important. And if you don't understand that, it becomes almost impossible for you to figure out what to do. So you understand that first, and then you try to figure out how you can make yourself distinct, right? And that doesn't always mean doing something different. It can also mean doing the same thing but doing it better, right? It's
Right.
one or the other. You either have to do it
Yeah.
better, or you have to do something completely different.
Something completely
So,
different. Right.
market trends are extremely important in some industries, like adaptive industries, fashion, extremely important, because customer needs are changing and they're emerging. But in visionary structures or classical structures, you don't have that situation. If you're in a classical structure, it's all about execution because the industry isn't changing. If it's visionary, it's trying to identify something that's completely different that customers may not even be aware exists, or customers are not being served by that value proposition. And then you create a niche by doing that. And therefore, market trends aren't necessarily um, as important in these types of industries. It becomes much more important that you strategically identify something that differentiates your firm. So, market trends can be more or less valuable depending on who you're competing against and what the structure of your competition is.
Oh, okay. So we've talked a good bit about things outside of the business, and a little bit on the internal. So, uh, what should a business analyze internally so that they can be competitive, or make sure that they have the resources to be competitive?
Right. Another good question. One of the things that we academic professors argue a lot about this, and that is a SWOT analysis valuable? Um, when I was teaching innovation and technology at Virginia Tech, I was co-teaching executives with a UVA professor, and they loved the SWOT tool at UVA, but at Virginia Tech, we taught our executives that SWOT was a good brainstorming tool, but a very poor tool for making decisions. And the reason for that is that an opportunity can oftentimes be a threat. A strength can sometimes be a weakness. So be very wary of how you make decisions. But one thing that companies continue to do is they still look at opportunities, right? And that is trying to identify something that's not being done out there, or a customer need that's not being served, or a customer need that's not being served well by existing competitions, and then develop internal capabilities that allow you to deliver value in that area better than everybody else. So, this is where I really transition into resource-based theory, that competitive advantage is created when you take resources and capabilities, you combine them in very unique ways so
Mhm.
that you can end up delivering value that is unique. And once those capabilities are established, then you can oftentimes establish a competitive advantage that's sustainable over time. So there are really two things involved in this, and I have used this in my classes, and that is to have the graduate students do a resources and capabilities grid. And that is, first, identify those things that are really important to the industry, and then identify things that you do well. And if the things that are really important in an industry, if you're not doing those things well, you've got a problem. And it means you have to reallocate or move resources over to develop a capability of delivering on that industry characteristic better, or you need to outsource it to someone who can do it well. But equally important is that if you're doing something really well that is not important to the consumer, then you're wasting resources, right? So this
Right.
gets back to Porter's article called "What is Strategy?" That strategy is just as importantly about what you don't do as what you do. So it means figuring out what the industry demands, figuring out what your customer wants, and then developing capabilities. That's allocating resources and capabilities to become dominant. Develop competencies that are dominant on those industry attributes, and minimize expenditures on capabilities that are not all that important to the industry and consumers.
Oh, interesting. And I know, with it being 12:48 here, I'm going to jump ahead to a couple other questions here. One of them being, what resources are available for businesses to do their competitor research?
Yeah, I always say that you need to find industry reports. And it doesn't matter how small or large your business is. And these industry reports, Standard & Poor's has industry reports on just about every industry.
Mm.
I'm sure that the Small Business Development Center does as well.
Yeah, we
But
got a couple.
yeah, so this needs to be your first go-to, right?
Mhm.
Find out who you're competing with. Do a five forces analysis. Understand, who are you competing with, but just as importantly, where is profitability being reduced? Are suppliers squeezing profits? Are distributors squeezing profits? Or substitute products attracting consumers away from you? Also, do a strategic group map or a strategy map so that you can understand what competitors are competing in which industry segment. Because if you want to compete in an industry group where you have existing competitors that are very strong, that may not be a good place for you to compete. Read your competitors' websites. I get this a lot. in some student papers, right? So some student papers are outstanding. Others will take an existing company and they don't even go back and read the materials from that company. They don't read the 10K report if it's a publicly traded company. They don't read the websites, and they draw conclusions that are inconsistent with what they would have learned if they had just simply done a little bit of reading, right?
Mm-hmm.
So read published documents. Visit your competition. The more data you have, all things being equal, the better. As long as you don't, it's sort of like chewing a clam. You don't want to chew too much because the clam gets larger and larger and difficult to swallow, right? So you have to do a lot of good analysis, but at some point you have to say, all right, I've done enough.
Mm-hmm.
What conclusions can I draw from these analyses? Now let's move forward.
Right. Right. And you brought up something pretty interesting there. It's visit your competition. So many clients are apprehensive to do that. Like, is that even legal? Can I do that? Of course you could do it. Go take a look. Go see for yourself. Be a
Have to.
customer. Pretend to be a customer. I've done that myself.
One of the greatest examples I can think about is Harley Davidson, which when they were owned by, was it AMP, the bowling ball company?
Mm,
They were producing really poor quality motorcycles in the 60s and 70s. And in the 1980s, this was when Ronald Reagan was president, and he actually banned the import of Japanese motorcycles of 750 cc's or more to try to help Harley Davidson. Harley Davidson actually asked Honda if they could come visit their assembly line facilities, and Honda said yes. They went in and they observed how Honda was doing things, and then today Harley has some of the highest quality motorcycles, that are equal in quality to Japanese motorcycles, right? Slightly different because they tend to customize, but a great example that why Honda allowed them to come in is beyond me, but they did.
yeah.
And it gave Harley enormous information that then, imitation is the best form of flattery, right? You imitate what other good firms are doing, and once you do that well, you can move on to innovating, right?
Mm,
So it's a two-step process, really important.
very important. Yes. And then, so two questions here. What then, real quick, what is strategy? And then how may that differ between a startup business versus a business that's been around maybe 5+ years?
Right. And we addressed this early on in the semester because when I was at Pepsi and TI, we used to do what today they call budgeting, but we used to get executives into a room for 3 or 4 days, and we would discuss what do we want to do for the next year, right?
Mhm. Right.
And so we developed these objectives, and then we funded them, and we handed them off to our lower level production people and said, do it. Um, the problem with that, of course, is the competitors are always going to respond to what you do, which means that you need to be formulating strategy and making adjustments to it throughout the year, depending on what happens. So today, we no longer view that as being the proper way of doing strategy. You don't want to separate strategic planning from the implementation phase. They both have to be continuous throughout the year.
Mhm.
And so today's strategy is really about trying to understand or trying to identify the proper industry segment that you want to compete in, try to identify white space, understanding what we call key success factors. What are things that every company in the industry must do? In fast food, it's a quality product, cleanliness, service, value. Beer brewing, it's clever advertising, wide distribution, and capacity utilization. It's
Mhm.
those three things are important for anybody who brews beer, even if you're a startup company. Once you've done that, then you have to turn to your resources and capabilities. Now that you understand uh, what you want to do and what the industry demands, now you want to build capabilities that allow you to deliver that product or service and give the consumer the same thing that is matching up perfectly with the industry key success factor. So in the end, you want the competitive advantages of your of your company to be identical to the key success factors of the industry. I don't think that it differs. In a small business, typically many small businesses compete in established industries that have other competitors. So this becomes really important that you identify what's going on in the industry right now, because competition is going to be, quite frankly, a lot more difficult. If you're a startup company, you're oftentimes coming out with a brand new product. You're entering white space where there are no competitors, and all of a sudden your strategic planning is slightly different in that you have to decide, when do I launch this product? Should I launch it really quickly to try to block competition, or do I hold off until I'm able to create a product that is good enough that when buyers acquire the product for the first time, it'll actually perform the way it's supposed to. So that's a good example of where small businesses and startups can be extremely different in how you conduct this analysis.
Yes, and my last question here actually has two parts to it. So how should a business roll out their strategy? And I'm sure that's a difference between if it's just you versus you having a team, and then follow-up question: what mistakes do people make when communicating this strategic plan to their team?
Right. Yeah, and that's another really great question, because if you're a small business owner, oftentimes you as the business owner, you're the one formulating strategy and you're the one implementing it. You're essentially doing everything. You're doing the finance, you're doing the marketing. As you grow, you start to hire people who can specialize in finance or accounting and so on. One of the problems, of course, that small businesses get into from a leadership point of view is that small business owners oftentimes have a really difficult time letting go. They are so used to controlling every aspect of the business. Elon Musk is a great example of this. They talk a lot on, if you listen to the business news in the morning, they talk a lot about how he works so hard that he makes himself ill, right? This is a great example of, and Elon Musk is brilliant. I really admire him, but he's had a really tough time letting go. And as you get larger and larger, you've got to do that. And that means your leadership style changes, your strategy changes. So larger organizations is very different. Executives are going to formulate strategy at the top. So strategy is a top-down process, but implementation then has to be undertaken by other people in the organization. You can't be the one to actually be implementing strategy. The two have to be done by different groups of people in the organization.
Right.
Building successors are very, very important. Hiring the right people, involving people in this process, very important. I've done a lot of work with Accenture and PricewaterhouseCoopers on mergers and acquisitions. How do you integrate acquisitions? Because more than half of acquisitions fail. One of the primary reasons that they fail is that, number one, companies that acquire other companies, they just fail to communicate, and they don't involve people from the other organization in the process. It's the same way in any small business, or any business for that matter. If you're not communicating with your people, you don't get buy-in from your people, and you end up with what we call strategic incoherence. If you're not communicating correctly, different people or units in your organization end up having different understandings of what your strategy actually is. You don't want that. You want every group and every person in your organization to know exactly what your mission is, exactly what your vision is, what your strategy is, what your value proposition is. And that's when your resources and capabilities are used very effectively. And this, the last thing then is that you really have to focus on your resources and capabilities. Are you spending your capital efficiently? Are you spending it to develop capabilities that are directly related to solving that customer problem that you've set out to do?
Perfect. And I lied to everybody. I actually have a couple more questions. They're a little bit unrelated though, but they're kind of fun. So, what are you reading, or do you have any book recommendations for those that are listening?
This is always a very difficult thing, because if you I've spent a lot of time in airports over the years, and if you walk into one of the Barnes and Noble bookstores and you need reading, if I'm flying to Japan or China, you're talking about a 2-day flight. You're desperate for anything to use up time. But the books that you find in the bookstores tend to be things on new fads. So just-in-time inventory, re-engineering, economies of scale. These are all things that are sort of faddish. Michael Porter would say that these contribute to greater productivity in your organization. The problem, though, is that these things can be easily copied by other competitors in your industry. So they're very rarely the source of a sustainable or a long-term competitive advantage. What you really need to be doing is finding books that help you focus on your knowledge of how to allocate resources and capabilities, how to create and serve good value propositions, how to understand your industry. Michael Porter has a book that was probably written in 1985 now, called Competitive Strategy. It introduces the 5 forces model. It's still a really widely read book, though you could read the Harvard Business Review article on this. They continue to update it every few years. I would look at Harvard Business Review has a book called The 10 Must Reads on Strategy. Really great collection. Jim Collins is not overly sophisticated in his analysis. If you look at his books, Good to Great, Built to Last. However, Good to Great, especially, you can go on to Amazon and you can buy one of those books for about $2. There are thousands of them out there, and his chapters are simplistic, but they have wonderful rules. Do you want to be a hedgehog or a fox? Stick to the knitting. First people, then strategy. These are things that I think small businesses should really think about very hard. And so these types of books become really invaluable. Richard Rumelt has a book called Good Strategy, Bad Strategy that talks about serving the customer, solving customer problems. These are the types of things that I would be reading. I'd also be looking at Harvard Business Review too. Check the index. They come out with great articles that are written by executives. So some are designed for larger organizations, but others more about strategy or industry analysis. More generally, that can be very valuable for small businesses.
Yes. One last question, promise. What is your favorite productivity tip for simplifying maybe life hack for entrepreneurs?
Well, I always go back to what Richard Rumelt said in that video that I use in the first week of my class, and that is that strategy is all about solving a customer problem. You can't just decide that you've got a product that serves a customer need and expect to be successful if the customer really doesn't have a need for that product, right? So you've got to understand what a customer needs first. That's really paramount. The second thing is that you never want your strategy to become overly complicated. You never want to chase too many things. You don't want to have 3 or 4 competitive advantages. It's much better to have a single competitive advantage where you are focusing the allocation of your resources, developing capabilities to deliver on that single competitive advantage better than everybody else. And then last, you've got to execute flawlessly. If you're a small business, you don't have the scale that a Fortune 500 company has. That means you've got to attract the consumer, and you've got to get that consumer to come back over and over and over again. It doesn't matter if you're a hardware store, a restaurant. It's all the same. You want the consumer to come back over and over, and you're going to achieve that by executing very well every time that consumer is in your store. You alienate them once, they're going to go to somebody else. You'll never see them again.
Never see him again. I have learned a lot out of this conversation. I greatly appreciate your time. Thank you so much for coming. And like I said, learned a bunch here. Got a couple new books that now I got to add to my list, so I'll be busy. But thank you, Dr. Krug. I really appreciate it.
Enjoyed it, and I hope everyone got something out of that. I appreciate you inviting me.
Absolutely. All righty. And again, thank you everybody for coming. I would like to share couple screens here. We have our social media up here. Please follow us at Penn State SBDC. And if you'd like to contact us, here's our contact information, our website at sbdc.psu.edu. And here we have our contact information as well. All right, everybody, thank you so much for coming. And again, thank you to our guest, Dr. Krug, for coming. And everybody, have a wonderful rest of your day.